So the end of World War II in the Pacific. It's a story most of us think we know, right? But when you really dig into the final days of the Japanese Empire, you find a truth that is way more complex and, honestly, more surprising than what we learned in history class.
I mean, the question seems so simple. For over 75 years, the answer has pretty much been taught as a straightforward fact. But was it really that cut and dry? Let's unpack the real story behind one of the most critical decisions of the entire 20th century.
You know the story. The conventional narrative is powerful. It's clear. August 6th and 9th, 1945, the United States drops atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. A few days later, a totally stunned Japan surrenders. End of story. That's what we've all been told. But, when you look closer, that simple story starts to get a little shaky. We're talking about a nation where surrender was seen as the ultimate unforgivable dishonor. So what else was going on behind the scenes that could possibly force the hand of an empire sworn to fight to the very last man, woman, and child? To really get it, we have to rewind to the summer of 1945. The United States is closing in on Japan, but they're facing a series of just absolutely grim options for how to finally end this war. Well, before the atomic bombs, there was fire, a lot of it. The U.S. had already switched to this brutal firebombing campaign. General Curtis LeMay's B-29s were just systematically torching Japan's cities, which were mostly made of wood and paper. The raid on Tokyo in March of 45 alone killed 100,000 people. And yet, despite all of this unimaginable devastation, Japan's leadership said nothing. They refused to surrender. Okay, so if burning down their cities didn't work, what was next? Well, a naval blockade could starve millions, but it would take way too long. That really only left one option on the table: Operation Downfall, a full-scale, boots-on-the-ground invasion of Japan. For the military planners, it was a terrifying prospect, but it seemed like it was the only way. And the price tag for that invasion? Planners were estimating it could lead to as many as 700,000 American casualties. That is a staggering number. It would make the D-Day landings look like a small skirmish. But the projected losses for the Japanese? Well, that was on a whole other level of catastrophic. The government was in the process of mobilizing 28 million civilians, training them to fight invading American soldiers with, get this, bamboo spears if they had to. It was going to be a final, suicidal defense of their homeland. So to understand this willingness for total self-destruction, we have to get inside the heads of Japan's military leaders. This wasn't just about strategy for them. This was a deeply, deeply ingrained cultural and political belief system. At the very heart of this mindset was a really twisted version of Bushido, the old samurai code. In its World War II form, it demanded absolute sacrifice. Death in battle was the highest honor. Surrender was an unimaginable, unforgivable shame. And this philosophy is what directly led to things like the suicidal bonsai charges and the ritual suicides that we saw all across the Pacific War. And this was all supercharged by a modern political ideology called state Shinto. It basically elevated the emperor to the status of a living god. And it demanded absolute, unquestioning loyalty, not just from soldiers, but from every single citizen. The individual person meant nothing. The state, which was embodied by the god emperor, was everything. And if you want to know how extreme this all was, listen to this. The war minister, a man named Kurishika Anami, actually said, "Would it not be wondrous for this whole nation to be destroyed like a beautiful flower?" He genuinely believed that total national annihilation was better than surrender. This was the mindset the Allies were up against. Okay, so with all that in mind, let's go to those critical days in August of 1945. Because Japan was about to get hit by not one, but two absolutely devastating shocks that completely changed the game in just a matter of hours. Just look at how fast this all happens. It's breathtaking. On August 6th, Hiroshima. 2 days later, a massive political shock. The Soviet Union declares war on Japan. Then, just after midnight, 1.6 million Soviet troops storm into Manchuria. And then only 11 hours after that, the second atomic bomb hits Nagasaki. It was just a relentless, overwhelming series of catastrophes. Now, this is absolutely crucial. While the horror of the atomic bombs is undeniable, for Japan's leaders, the Soviet invasion might have actually been the bigger strategic blow. Why? Because their entire last-ditch diplomatic plan was to convince the Soviets, who were neutral up to this point, to help them negotiate a peace deal with better terms. With that invasion, That hope was completely, utterly gone.
Now, you would think that 2 nuclear bombs plus Soviet invasion would trigger an immediate surrender. But it didn't, not even close. Inside the Japanese government, the leadership was totally paralyzed.
See, the decision to surrender had to come from this group, the Big Six, the Supreme Council for the Direction of the War, and they were deadlocked, 3-3. The hardline military leaders, the guys on top of the list, they just would not budge. And the divide was pretty clear. The peace faction said, okay, we'll accept surrender, but with one non-negotiable condition. We have to preserve the emperor's position. But the war faction, led by Anami, they demanded 4 impossible conditions, including things like no foreign occupation. It was a complete fantasy, and it created total paralysis.
So, with the government completely unable to act, something happened that was totally unprecedented. Emperor Hirohito, who was seen as this divine figurehead who just rubber-stamped decisions, he personally intervened. In a midnight conference, he broke the deadlock himself, with his own words siding with the peace faction.
Okay, so let's put all these pieces together. This brings us to the core of it all. It wasn't one single event, but a rapid-fire combination of factors that, in the end, required a very unique solution to end the war.
Here's how it all came together. First, the A-bombs shattered the military's fantasy of winning one last glorious battle on Japanese soil. Second, the Soviet invasion completely wiped out any hope of a negotiated peace. Together, these created a massive crisis, but also a political deadlock. And it took that final step, the emperor's personal, sacred decision to actually provide the solution.
And really, this is the key takeaway. The 2 atomic bombs and the Soviet invasion were the catalysts. They created this undeniable crisis that forced the leadership to finally confront reality. But it was Emperor Hirohito's personal intervention that gave the military the political and even the spiritual cover they needed to accept the unacceptable: surrender.
It just leaves you with this one last, kind of chilling thought. If a figure considered to be a living god hadn't made a decision that was his, and his alone to make, breaking centuries of tradition, how many more cities would have burned? And how many more millions would have died in a final apocalyptic battle for Japan?